So in terms of translating objectives to indicators, with our objective here, some potential indicators might be client's rating of staff expertise and courtesy. So you guys didn't quite mention that, although you did talk about how they were treated. You could look at time between client check-in and time between departures. So between departure and check-in, like how long does it take? Okay, most people like to get in and get out with their services. They don't like to be dilly-dallying around. Client views of waiting time for appointments and waiting times to be seen once they made a visit. So a little bit different from, from the time you get there till the time you leave. Now we're talking about waiting time once they make their visit. So once they get there, how long does it take for them to actually be seen by somebody? You could do observations of waiting time for telephone service during selected peak or off-peak hours. So how long is it taking for the phone to be answered? And then you could also do observations for time waiting at various stages during the appointment or during the visit. So, for example, if they, the time you check in to the time you get called back to the time you get, to actually see the doctor, from the time the doctor leaves until you get your discharge paperwork, like how long does each one of those take, could be something else that you could look at. And then you could also look at other things. So I think some of what you guys had up there in terms of return for continued or additional services, what services they received, were their expectations met, would they recommend it to somebody else, and how they were treated, I think are all going to be additional indicators that we could look at. Does that make sense? Okay, so in talking about what makes a credible indicator, then the indicator's got to obviously be clearly linked to the intervention outcome, or it's got to be linked to your objective and what it is that you're looking at. It also needs to be specific in terms of what will it measure. So you saw on the previous slide, observation of the time it took from this point to this point. So it's very clear, this is what we're measuring, and not just saying time. We're very, very clear about that. Appropriate for the population being served by the intervention. So making sure that whatever it is that you're looking at, that's appropriate. And then the other piece of that, so, we talk about appropriateness not only in terms of age, so what you might do with children is going to be different from what you do with adults, which may even be more different than what you do with seniors. Also, culturally appropriate. Some things, just aren't appropriate in some cultures, or they get misinterpreted in the fine print. So make sure that, what you're doing is going to be appropriate on all those levels. It's got to be feasible as well, given the resources and the skills needed to collect the data. So people always want to say, oh yeah, we can collect, biomarker data, we can do blood draws, things like that. In a lab, that's feasible. In the real world, not so much. Okay? So just think about, like, is this really going to work? I know, there's always a big push to do online surveys and getting people to, fill those out. But, remember, not everybody uses a computer. Most of us, a lot of people are on their cell phones. Even us, we're on our cell phones, unless we're at work or something. If it's pencil paper survey, then also making sure that it's in a language that people can read. Okay, so if obviously if they're non-English speaking, then it has to be translated into that language, and it needs to be translated appropriately. But the other piece of it too is reading level. Okay, so over the years, some of the work that I've done around health literacy, we find that things are written at like a 12th grade reading level or a 13th grade, 14th grade reading level, which indicates a high school graduate and some college. And reality is that things need to be written at an 8th grade level, and if you can get it down to a 6th or a 4th grade level, that's even better, So just making sure, and doing that on some level takes some expertise. Like you can use, I think Word will help you calculate out reading level. You can oftentimes copy and paste text and then into some formula that you can find on the internet, and that'll help you calculate out reading level. One key thing about what makes reading level so high is the number of syllables that you have in your words. So they're more polysyllabic words that you use. Then the higher the reading level. So you've got to think about that, as you're moving forward. Then does your staff have the skills to do the data collection and things like that? If you're going to do it online, do you need to think about having tablets? And then with tablets, that means you got to have Wi-Fi connection, and so on and so forth. So think about what's going to be feasible for you to collect your data. And then lastly, in terms of your indicators, is make sure that what you have is valid and reliable to stakeholders. So it's making sure that what you're collecting and what the indicator is represents the concept that it's intended to represent. Okay, so for example, if you are saying, we want to make sure our clients love our services, define what love is. What do you really mean by that? So, like the same with satisfaction. What do you really mean by that when you're talking about valid and reliable measures? The other thing to look at is the quality of the indicator. So if you want to make sure that your indicator is giving you the information that you want, then you have to have quality within your indicator. So looking at your data collection instrument and how the items are worded are very important. Related to that, and we'll talk more later this semester about measurement issues, but related to that is even just the layout of the survey. You know, some people like to do things front and back, but not everybody's used to reading front and back on a paper survey. So then they end up missing questions. And I've seen that happen before where people have missed questions because it's been on the backside of a piece of paper and they were like, respondents didn't realize that there were questions on the backside. Same thing with online surveys. So you always need to put in what we call skip patterns. Okay, so if somebody says no to a particular question, for example, like if you say, have you had alcohol in the last 30 days? If they say no, then it should skip down to the next set of questions. They shouldn't be saying no and then being asked, well, how many drinks have you had in the last 30 days? Blah, 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 because people then get frustrated because they're like, these questions don't apply to me, and either they start randomly ticking off stuff or they don't tick off, they just stop doing it. The procedures for collecting the data, so thinking about when you're going to collect the data, who are you going to collect the data from, how are you going to collect the data, all of those things kind of play into it as well. Training of those collecting the data, so, like in particular, if you're doing focus groups, you need to make sure that your focus group moderators are trained and they know how to handle certain things. They know the interview guide and they can run with it, etc. If you have people out in the field collecting data, making sure that they give the same response. If somebody says, "Hey, I don't understand this question," if it's a knowledge question, you don't want your staff people to be telling them the answer, because now then they're going, oh, now knowledge seems really high, and it's not really high, it's just based on the fact that somebody answered the question for them. So training becomes very important. Data management and quality assurance, okay? If any of you have ever sat and done data entry, it can be fun, tedious, and sometimes you get on a roll, and so I have to go back and look. I know back in the day, like when I was a doctoral student, over 20 years ago, and I had to do data entry. We had a program called EpiInfo. So you could then put the legal values in, like we did that for our data collection. We just programmed the survey. You could put the legal values in. So if like the only legal values or the only possible answers were like 1, 2, and 3, and you hit 9, it would like beep and it wouldn't let you enter, which is helpful because sometimes you get to rolling and you hit the wrong key and you don't realize you hit a key and then it becomes a hot mess. But even once you get things entered, you still need to go through and just check your data, make sure everything is okay. In some cases, you'll want to do what we call reverse code a question. So if you want the answer to be no, but the question is worded in such a way that they say yes, then you might need to reverse code that, and then so you have to go in and change like your 1s to 2s or your 2s to 1s and things like that. So it's all of that, like just kind of data management. And if you don't do that properly, then obviously that impacts what it is that you're doing. So some examples of indicators. So we're still now at a process monitoring, process evaluation. So here's some examples of indicators that you might use. So, first of all, let me just ask, do all of these make sense to you all? Anything that somebody's like not clear what we mean here? They all make sense. Okay. Alright, so these are the indicators. So you remember the table had the logic model outcome, it had the SMART objective, it had the evaluation question, and then it had the indicators. So we've gotten to the indicator. Now what we have to figure out is what's going to be our source of evidence. What are we going to be looking at that's going to give us this information? Okay? Whoops. So for sources of evidence, you can look at specific specific survey questions. Okay, so you might say, we're using this question on our intake survey, or we're using this question on from our satisfaction survey, or we're using interview questions. So we've got where we're doing interviews with people, and so we have questions specifically on there that are going to answer a particular indicator, or give us the data for an indicator. Again, the client intake risk assessment, so when people are coming in and you're trying to identify what their risks are, maybe that's where you could get some of this information from. Staff logs, so where your staff is logging in, here's what I did today, and here's how many people I saw, and here's the kinds of issues, and so on and so forth. You could also do client journals. Okay, sometimes, clients are asked to journal. Maybe it's about, fresh fruits and vegetables consumption, or physical activity, but it could be a whole host of things they could be asked to journal about. And so you could be looking at the journals for information from for your indicators. Skills demonstrations. So if you are teaching people how to do something, getting them to demonstrate that they know how to do it is also something that you could use for your indicators. Observations are always a good thing, so just observing what's going on, how people are learning, etc. A resource inventory, so looking at what are the resources that are in the community, or what are the resources that people are using, what are the resources that people aren't using. And then lastly, you could look at documentation of policy changes. So you have the original maybe your policies and procedures manual, hopefully you have one, and then you have, your revised policies and procedures manual, or the update on different policies. But these are different indicators, different sources of evidence that you can look at for your data. Yes?
How would you do resource inventory? So, like, for example, like AFAN, how would you know if they were going to the center for mentoring classes or getting condoms, or how would you ask them? Would you give the survey to the client with the resources?
Mm-hmm.
And that? Okay.
Mm-hmm. So you might be, it depends. So the indicator might be that we've established XYZ service. So then you could do the resource inventory to show, beforehand, here's how many things we had. Afterwards, here's how many things we had. So, you can kind of document where that's gone. Because that's usually how people use a resource inventory, is saying these are the resources in the community. Not necessarily whether or not people are using them, but these are what's available, or these are the services that are offered at these organizations. So you could say, at the end of your project, you now increase the number of resources that are available. Okay? So, source of evidence. Specificity here is going to be very important. Okay? Don't just put a survey, but be very specific. Say what survey it is that you're using, or which survey questions are you looking at. Okay? Or don't just say a database, but what exactly in the database you're looking at, or which database it is that you're referring to. So, again, being very specific. So if you look at this is like an airplane cockpit, for example. So if you're looking at that and you want to know, is the plane flying high? Well, you're not just going to say, go look at the instrumentation panel. If that was the case, you might as well say, go look out of the window. You're going to have several different things here that are going to tell you how high, how fast, which direction the airplane is going. And so your indicator needs to be very specific. Which actual indicator, which gauge are you looking at? Otherwise, you could just look out the window and try to figure out some of that information. So, and then think about it too. If you want people to, if you write the evaluation plan and you're giving it to an organization and you want them to be able to implement it, don't just tell them the database or a survey. You're going to want to be very specific. To answer this question, to know that you're meeting this is what you're looking at, and here's the survey, here's the question that you need to be looking at, so that they fully understand, and there's no, well, we don't know what question they wanted us to use kind of thing. So, data collection methods. On some level, I am assuming that you all have taken research methods. But I'm getting ready to put these tables up here so that you can see it. Because I think we don't always think about these in terms of data collection for evaluation. Sorry, I was just looking I was like, oh, I never noticed that was cut off. And I don't think I've ever seen it cut off before, so I don't know what's going on with that. Anyway, so you could do like an activity log, okay? And we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but you use that when you've got very discrete actions. So when people, you're going to be checking off either like how many times somebody did something, or that they signed in for this and then they went to that station, and so on and so forth. So it's really going to be quantitative data. These are the kinds of things you can be looking at. It becomes something that can be relatively easy to use and easy to analyze, because really it's just counts for the most part. And you can tailor it to your program activities, but it also can be long, okay? Which may not be a good thing. Plus, people get bored, and so when they get bored, then they don't fill them out regularly, or they just go, oh yeah. Once they get used to going in, they're like, oh yeah, so they don't fill it out. Another thing you could have is a checklist. So usually use a checklist when you're doing observations and you're watching and you're saying, okay, yes, we did all of these things. So some of the things you could look at, like around room setup and supportive comments. Checklists are pretty simple and it makes for easy data entry, but sometimes you can end up with a really long list. Okay, so then you've got to figure out what's the most important thing, and you've got to write consistent items you got to write items for consistent interpretation. So we have a checklist, but now we're all seeing something, we're interpreting it differently, so we don't well, I don't know. Did they do that? Did they not do that? We're not quite sure. Organizational records is one thing that you can look at. Usually having organizational records, you can, it's usually like existing records. So you can look at things around length of time on the wait list, number of purchased computers, so on and so forth. Usually it's pretty easy to access. Most organizations have, here's the receipt for the computer, here's this, here's that. But sometimes you're going to need a data abstraction form. So if you're looking at medical records and you want to make sure that you're collecting the same data for each person, then you're going to do what we call an abstraction form, where you have that form where you can collect all of the data, provided all of the data is there. Okay, So that's the challenge with records because sometimes they don't always come up like that. Same with client records, okay? De-identified client records, usually you can get access to under HIPAA for research purposes. You generally can get access to client records, so it's thinking through all of those. Again, it's going to be that quantitative data, so you can look at things like attendance, you can look at compliance with program elements. So, think about like a medical record, if you're being prescribed medication, and then, whether or not you're taking the medication, how things are going. Obviously, accessibility tends to be pretty easy. Again, that abstraction form is going to be needed so that you're making sure, we all have medical records. We all have different things in our medical records. So again, you're going to want that form to say, okay, these are the key, like we want to make sure we get age or birth date, race, gender, height, weight, blood pressure, maybe lab results or something. Now you guys know you go through all that and then some at the doctor's office. So your charts may have some of this and not have some of this. So just to make sure you're consistently getting that information, you've got to have that abstraction form. And sometimes when you've got really complex records, then trying to link them across people becomes important. Observations, always a good thing. We don't always think about doing observations, but just going in and just watching. What are people doing? So you can get things on interactions as well as event sequences. So how do things fold out, unfold? Some of the things you can look at. Your data may reveal some unexpected things, some things you didn't realize were going on. So for example, maybe if you're in a school cafeteria and you're observing, how lunch goes. And so principal says this, we follow these 3 steps for lunch, and maybe what you're realizing is that there's more like 4 or 5 steps, or only 2 of the 3 steps are actually being implemented. So it can also be naturalistic, so you can actually see the nature of what's going on. Time intensive, you're going to need a checklist, and it's going to be somewhat complex data analysis. So it may become more like a mixed methods kind of thing, where you've got some qualitative data, some quantitative data. May not be the easiest thing, depending upon who you're working with, for them to analyze. A questionnaire, that thing you guys are most familiar with. Obviously you can collect data real quickly with that. You have to have good questions in order to be able to collect the data. But also think about how you're going to, do that. So pencil, paper versus online, so on and so forth. Realize that with surveys, you're going to collect a lot of data, but you're not going to get a lot of depth, what we call depth. So you're not going to be able to explore the issues that arise in the survey. So you can get, the satisfaction, some of these things, pencil, paper, so on and so forth. The one thing about surveys is that the people that you're getting to be respondents have to be able to read, have to be able to understand. If not, you've got to be able to provide some kind of auditory version of the survey, and then a way of doing that. There is software out there that will do that. What do they call it? A CASI. So it's an audio computer assisted survey system that will actually, like, they can put a headphone on with like a phone or an iPad. They can answer the questions because it reads it to them, and then it gives them the options of the responses. All of that's read to them. Obviously, then if it's in a different, if somebody needs a different language, it can be programmed for a different language, so on and so forth. The other thing that makes surveys kind of bad to use is if you've got poorly written questions. Okay? So if you ask somebody, are you in love? Well, you didn't say what I was in love with, so you don't know what, that means. So, I mean, thinking through that and making sure people always say it's easy, but if you understand what you're really doing, it's not as simple as you think it is. So, just understanding, the nuances of doing surveys. So then the last two, you've got an interview, so you've got to have time to collect as well as the qualitative data. So with an interview, whether it's an individual interview or it's a focus group where it's more like a group interview, you're going to get a lot of information because you're going to get a lot of depth, but you're not going to be broad. You're not going to get it from a lot of people, okay? And so you have to decide which is more important. Do I have a little bit of data on a lot of people, or do I have a lot of data on a few people? Okay? And then making sure that you get representativeness and so on and so forth. So here's some things that you can look at. Obviously, you can get a lot of detail, you can get a lot of insight in terms of what's going on. But the challenge with the interviews is, for most people, it's going to be time intensive. Okay? I mean, even if I was to say, okay, I'm going to do an hour interview with each one of you all. Okay? There's 4 of you sitting in the classroom right now. That would be a 4-hour, that's like half a day, just interviewing. Not something that I'd want to do. The other part, too, is I have to have a private place to do the interviews. Okay? Or somewhere relatively private where people can do the interviews. So if you don't have that kind of privacy, then you're not going to get that participation from people, especially depending upon the questions that you ask. If you're asking more sensitive questions, they're not going to answer them. Sometimes, so I've had the experience of giving people survey questions, interview questions, and they go off with the questions and a tape recorder. And so, like each person is going now off on their own, so somebody can go in a corner and do their actual interview. They can talk however loud into the microphone. So they don't have to be very, very loud. They can be very quiet. Nobody has to hear them. Unless, of course, you got a big, deep voice like I do. My kids are like, Mom, your whisper is like some people's indoor voices. You don't whisper. And I'm like, yeah, okay. Anyway. So, but I mean, you have to think about that. How are you going to make it private enough that people can do it? And so if you're, again, doing multiple interviews and so on and so forth, it can take some more time. Data analysis tends to be more complex, okay? It's not just sitting down, running a program or saying, oh, I need to run frequencies, and then, SPSS calculates it for us. Yes, you can use software to do your data analysis, but you've got to go in and tell the software what it is that you're doing or what it is that you're calling each part of the transcript or of the interview. Plus, that also assumes, too, that you have transcription of the interviews. So, I mean, it just adds a whole nother layer, a whole nother expense, unless you yourself plan on sitting down and reviewing and typing in, transcribing the interviews and things like that. And even at that, once you transcribe the interviews or you have somebody else transcribe the interviews, then you got to sit down and review the interviews and make sure everything was correct. Because, most times your transcriptionist isn't going to be there during the interview or during the focus group, and so they don't know what it is that you're talking about. So now you've got to sit down and make sure everything is correct. Case study, not something we do a lot of in terms of evaluation, but something you could consider. When you need to understand fully what's going on with a program and its context, then you're going to want to do a case study. So you might look at the degree to which managerial personnel make changes to assure intervention fidelity. So you're kind of just documenting out, like, what's that process going on. It obviously gives you a thorough picture of the program and what's going on, but it also can be complex because oftentimes you end up with some kind of mixed methodology over time. It's going to be time intensive, so on and so forth. So these are all, yes, even though you've taken research methods, these are different ways, in particular with evaluation, you can collect data and stuff moving forward. So that's the last slide, and so what I want to do the rest of the class, or at least for a little bit longer, is to actually do some activities, kind of walk you through. Before I switch, I hand out an activity. I just want to give you an example. So we talk about how do you collect the data. For the teen pregnancy prevention project that I ran, after every intervention session, our instructors had to complete this abstinence fidelity log, okay? So each one is tailored to the intervention, to that particular session that was going on. And so we have to list out, did they do whatever the core elements are, the core activities are? If they didn't, did they, make any adaptations? Was it planned, unplanned? Sometimes, things happen. You're in a building and fire alarm goes off. You have no control over that, And so you just have to document it. Hey, we didn't do this activity because the fire alarm went off and we had to leave. And then, do they feel it was effective? So on and so forth. And then the same thing for the next activity. So to kind of give you an example, particularly talking about process monitoring and process evaluation, like what are the things that we're looking for? Like if we want to say, oh, we implemented all of the sessions with fidelity, this is one way we can tell by having this fidelity monitoring log. So, okay. Let me